The VRD Carbon is the newest platform from Vanquish Products. Today, we're gonna build up this new kit, show you everything that's included inside and what it's gonna take to complete this new high performance kit. What's going on, everyone? This is the new VRD Carbon. VRD is the new platform that you see here in front of you, and this is performance-oriented chassis kit. This comes as a slider, so no wheels, tires, body, or electronics are included with this kit. Those are things that you'll add to your preference to finish this thing out. In today's video, what I'm gonna do is go through all of the bullet points of the kit and walk through the construction of the kit itself. Just going over the high level points, things that I think you should know, things that'll point out along the way during your kit build. But before we get into those steps, I want to hit some of those high level points. Now, as you can see, it's got a 3mm thick carbon fiber chassis to it. It's got the traditional taper to it, so narrower in the front, a little wider in the center, then back to narrow again. The chassis kit does include molded bumpers, front and rear. The bumpers are just a little bit wider than the frame rails, so keeps you legal, but doesn't get in the way. The VRD chassis has a 6-degree skid plate to it. Now, since it uses the VFD transmission, which puts the motor as far forward and as low as possible to try and keep the motor from being exposed below the chassis, the transmission is actually kicked at 3 degrees. So there's a compound angle between how the transmission bolts in and how the skid plate is put into the chassis. This is using the F10 portal axles under it. And as a total of this truck, you've got about a 37% overdrive. The transmission has the 21% overdrive lightweight machined gear set inside, so keeps the transmission light overall. The axles have the standard gear ratio in the rear and the overdrive in the portals in the front. That all combined gives you that 37% overdrive. The transmission spec here, as I said, it's got the lightweight machined gears that were released here recently on their own. It also doesn't spec using the covers that go over top of the top shaft, and there's a new tray that replaces one of the posts on the driver's side of that transmission. The transmission does come with the aluminum posts and the lightweight machined motor plate. The chassis comes with these bent aluminum sliders here. The overall width is pretty consistent with a number of the bodies that are available on the market now. Body mounting is done in a way that's fairly adjustable. The body post mount in the front can move forward, backward, up and down, and comes with 4 short body posts. The rear mounts are separate and they can be moved however you like, flipped forward to back, and also they can be put on this mid brace here in case you're using a cab only design and you wanted to have a way to mount that with a body post off of that. All of the links on this truck use the new Pro rod ends. This is a more rigid rod end. The rear is a high clearance lower link. The upper links all the way around are the thinner diameter to save some weight. You also have the thinner diameter tie rod up front, and that's connected to the servo on axle mount that's new for this F10 axle. That puts your servo directly on the axle and sits on top of it. Nice clearance between the servo and your transmission still, and you get tons of suspension travel. The shocks that come on this are the 90mm S8Es, and they do come with the hard anodized body, so a little bit nicer spec of shock than has come in any of the kits before. The skid plate on this is a new skid plate. You can see it's a very simple, very flat and minimal skid to it. The extension that goes up to cover the motor is separate. You can unbolt it if you'd like, but it's on there specifically to go up and protect the motor. It hugs super close to it. In this build already, I've put a Fusion Pro. Drops in there, no clearance issues at all, super simple installation. For battery and electronics mounting, you've got some flexibility. There's 2 Velcro straps that are included that you can use on the side plates if you'd like to put batteries down there. Also, there's that new tray that's included that takes place of one of the posts on the VFD. It should give you enough room to mount most electronics for a truck like this. You can fit a fairly decent sized battery if you're trying to get a lot of runtime out of this. Being performance oriented, oftentimes you're using smaller packs from 450 milliamps to 2200 milliamps, depending on your system and how much runtime you're looking to get. I have the VXT2 tires installed on some KMC impact wheels, and I've got the 2-stage foam from Vanquish inside of that VXT tire. But behind that, you'll also see the new cast style knuckle weight that's included. This is a little bit lighter than the brass version of these same low offset weights. But with this cast knuckle weight, using a KMC impact with a 225 hub, you can still clear everything just fine. Now, not all wheels will clear with a 225, but this combo specifically clears just fine. That little bit of added weight out of the box is a nice little benefit, helps to move your weight bias forward and keeps everything nice and low. Let's jump into the kit build itself, go through those details, then we'll come back and I'll show you some of the other details and final thoughts. Inside the kit, you'll find the instruction book. Bag A will contain the front axle parts. Bag B will have the rear axle parts. Bag C will be many of the molded chassis pieces and the suspension links. Bag D has the transmission parts. Bag E is the shock components. Bag F will be your drive shaft parts. Bag G is for shock and body mounting. And the carbon fiber frame rails are separate in the bottom of the box. You'll also find a small bag of spare parts with some of the extra chassis braces, some spare rod ends, your 4-way, and a few pieces of extra hardware. During the assembly of the front axle, you're only going to put the lower 2 M3x10 screws into the third member. The upper 2 are going to be used for the servo on axle mount, so make sure to leave those 2 uninstalled during the first step. The front axle comes with these cast knuckle weights. Now, this is the outer portion of the front portal axle. When you're assembling it, make sure you get that top bearing in that weight pressed down in there firmly. You can use the 4-way wrench that comes with the kit if you need something to help push it down. Note, once you have the knuckles installed, you will have the original molded plastic knuckle covers also available. These aren't used, just set them to the side. Your steering should move pretty freely at this point. If you had any troubles getting those kingpin screws aligned to the knuckle, it's likely that you just need to press everything in a little bit tighter to make sure that that bearing gets seated in the upper portion of that portal knuckle cover. You can install your servo into the servo on axle mount. A centered servo horn is included with the kit, but you will need to provide your own hardware to attach that 25 spline servo horn onto your servo of choice. When you put the servo on axle mount onto the axle, that's when you'll put those last 2 screws into the third member. Note when building the steering linkage that these are a 1-to-1 drawing, so match the length of the links as you assemble them to the manual here. You can easily match it to the inside shoulder of the rod ends. That usually works best for me. When building the rear axle, note that the portal gear set in the rear axle is different than the front set. The rear set uses the standard gear ratio, while the front portal boxes use the overdrive. The differences in the portal box gear ratios contribute to the 37% overall overdrive of the kit. When assembling the carbon fiber chassis, note that the carbon is 3mm thick, so it's got some rigidity to it. The instructions have you install it with all of the cross braces throughout except for the skid plate. The mid cross brace here, which will be just behind the skid plate, will force the chassis to bow out just a little bit. That's intended, and the skid plate will cause even a little bit more taper, giving the chassis the narrow, wide, narrow profile that in the end it's intended to have. Now, the body mounting positions are also put in a generic location. These posts can be moved around to allow you to move the actual body post locations, both front and rear. You can install your shock screws into those posts, or you can put the shocks in a location that you use an M3 nut on the back side of. This just gives you the ability to adjust how and where you want the body to be mounted, front and rear. Also note, you can remove the rear body post mounts and they can be moved to this mid-span cross brace. It's got the same bolt pattern across the top. This can be helpful if using cab only style bodies. While completing the assembly of the chassis, a few little things to note. The upper front links require a 14mm screw. And the rear upper links use a 16mm screw. So make sure you pay close attention to the length of the hardware when assembling that. The rear upper links go through the aluminum outer slider plate, so that accounts for a little bit of the length difference. The 14mm is important on the front screw so that you don't run into any drive shaft clearance down the road. Also make sure to note the orientation of the skid plate when you put it in the chassis. You want to make sure that the skid extension that bolts on separately, that portion is pointed towards the front when you first install it. When assembling the links, you'll note that the lower links are the larger, heavier diameter, and the upper links are the thinner diameter, and that goes the same front and rear. In the rear, you'll notice that you do have a high clearance bent lower link. When assembling the transmission, the final output shaft to the rear end does not have a 1-to-1 on it. There's 2 holes in this shaft. The larger of the 2 holes will be the one that sticks to the outside of the transmission, and that's for your drive shaft cross hole. The smaller of the 2 gets a 10mm cross pin so that it engages with the final gear to the rear output. All of the gears inside of this VFD transmission are the lightweight machine gear. It saves you a ton of weight here in the transmission, and the transfer case gear set also provides 21% overdrive. After you've installed the VFD into the VRD chassis, you will note that you do have some parts left over. The decorative shrouds for the VFD transmission case are not used in this case. Also, there's this little electronics or whatever type of tray you'd like to use it for that replaces one of the posts in the VFD. That aluminum post is still provided in case you don't want to use that tray, and instead you want to install the second aluminum post. When installing the front axle into the chassis, on page 20, it notes that there's 4 M3x16 screws used. That is actually a misprint. The top 2 screws should be 20mm long. The hardware that's included in the packaging is correct, but the manual shows 2 screw lengths that are incorrect, and that will be definitely updated here in the future, but that's one thing to note. Also, in that hardware bag, there is a mix of 20s and there's 2 22mm long screws. Find those 2 22mm long screws, and they're used for the rear upper shock mounting location. They will blend in with the 20s if you don't note those and put those to the side. All right, after getting everything built, we've got it sitting here. Now I've used a Proline cliffhanger body and dropped it on top. I've got it mounted so that it sits basically right down on top of the shock towers, putting the body posts in the lowest position with the body mounts in the factory location. Pretty easy to mount up a cliffhanger body, and the width fits perfectly for the sliders that are included. Compared to the manual, I did take and flip the rear bumper over just to give a little bit more departure angle. It is a nice increase in clearance back there. Of course, it does require you to trim your body up higher. Being that I used a Fusion Pro in this, kept the wiring super clean, was able to just put my receiver on that new tray, put the power switch here on the side, and route the plug over to the other side. This is something that I'll likely shorten and probably change this over to an XT30, as that's what most of my comp batteries are. Now the servo on axle mount on here, I've got a Reef's 1100 Smart Servo mounted in there. Gives you a 4-link front suspension. Again, the same narrow profile upper links, helps with clearances and just reducing the weight up high. Going with servo on axle is very responsive. This chassis will support a chassis mounted steering setup and a pan hard mount. That's going to be available separately down the road in case that's something you're after. Now, my ready to run weight of this truck with the battery and this cliffhanger body is 5 pounds 7 ounces. I do have additional brass inner clamp rings in the front wheels for a little bit of weight there, but beyond that, everything else is factory and then my added electronics. An important thing to note is that this truck is very familiar to me. This is basically the truck that I've been running for a year and a half or so, with minor revisions along the way until the final design was nailed down. But the chassis design and geometry and skid plate on this, pretty much how I've been running my truck for quite some time, even the Porsche. The Porsche here is even pretty much just a modified version of this same thing. The chassis had to be redesigned to not have the angled skid, but the skid plate that's in here is just one of the early molded prototypes of what is in this chassis. So in the end, even though this is a fresh build of it, it's pretty much exactly how I've been setting up my comp trucks for some time now. There's a number of option parts that are coming for this platform as well to be able to change things up even a little bit further depending on what your preference is for electronics and layout for servos, things like that. So watch out for all of those to be released here soon also. But I think I'll paint this one. We'll take a stab at it at least. After that, we'll get it out on the rocks here very soon, show you guys just how it is just out of the box. This has been a fantastic truck for me. I've really enjoyed driving it, and I'm looking forward to them being out on the market now. This segment of the market has a handful of options now, which is super exciting. This isn't a scale type truck, as you can tell by the flat plate carbon fiber frame rails. This is just a performance oriented option. Whether or not you want to comp, beside the fact, if you just want high performance, you just want to try and do gnarly lines and big climbs, this is a fantastic option for that. If it's something you're after, I'm positive that you'll enjoy this one. If you've got any questions or comments, anything you'd like to know about the truck, let me know. Drop a comment below. As always, I appreciate you guys for watching these videos. Hit the like button if you enjoy it. Subscribe if you're not already. Hit the notification bell so you see the videos as soon as they get uploaded. As always, thanks again for watching. We'll see you on the next one.